half of the ops stage. Whew, it's a lot. There's a lot going on today. So always good to remind the audience. And Mo, very excited to have you host this.
Thank you. It's a
So
pleasure.
your session is particularly interesting. Go-to-market teams heavily overcomplicate metrics. You really only need one. Take it away.
Awesome. So really looking forward to the discussion and the questions. So it's a pretty short deck actually, but I'm also lying. There's actually two metrics, but it's fine. I think it's the spirit of one metric. So just a little bit about myself. I work at Hootsuite. I'm the VP of self-serve. Been at Hootsuite for about 11 years, and I was asked to add some interesting facts. My best friend helped me out. So speak French and Arabic. My favorite show isn't actually Emily in Paris. He wrote this, but it is a show I'm watching right now. And I do appreciate a good pair of corduroy pants. So all accurate facts. So I'm just going to get straight to it. So the metric, in my opinion, that every go-to-market team needs to be looking at is LTV to CAC or LTV to CAC, however you want to pronounce it. Why is that? The goal, if you go back a sec and just think about what is the goal of a go-to-market function or go-to-market leader, it's to create a high-performance revenue engine. And so that's why the one metric you need to think about nonstop is LTV to CAC. Why LTV to CAC? In short, if you have a good LTV to CAC or LTV to CAC, what it means is you've created an engine where you can, so let's say your LTV to CAC is 3, and I'll explain that in a second. You've created an engine essentially where you put in $1 and you get back $3. That's incredible. That's essentially financial alchemy. Like that means you have a high performance engine. Your company is operating really, really well. These are kind of benchmarks you have on the right. Under 1 is essentially unacceptable. That's not a real business, in my opinion. You can be there in the short term when you're figuring things out. Long term, you can't be below 1x LTV CAC, because what it means is every customer you're bringing in is only going to pay itself off after a few years. That's not a real sustainable business. Typically, you see a lot of businesses between 1.1 to 3, and then 3 plus is kind of best in class. As with all benchmarks, this is very contextual. There's the life cycle of the business. Are you kind of in early venture mode? Are you in scale mode? Are you kind of in a more mature company? So there's a bunch of factors that play into this. But as a general rule of thumb, that's a great return. Something I often talk to people about is like the S&P 500. Like if you can't beat the S&P 500 with the returns your company's generating, that's something you need to really look into. Here's where I kind of lied. So it's not one metric, it's 2 metrics. I'm a big fan of pairing metrics. This is something that a lot of people, including Keith Rabois, who's ex-PayPal and a venture capitalist, he talks about a lot. I love the concept of pairing metrics because if you don't pair metrics, sometimes you can get adverse outcomes or perverse incentives. In math, this is called a constraint maximization problem, is essentially what we're solving for the math geeks in the audience. But basically, you want to pair your LTV CAC with the rule of 40. And I'll explain what the rule of 40 is for a second, but I'll tell you why it's so important to pair your metrics. You can really decrease the scale of your go-to-market significantly to improve your LTV CAC. So you can say, okay, I'm acquiring 1,000 customers, not very profitably today. What if I just acquired 1 customer next year, but an LTV CAC? Again, you don't really have a business there. It needs to be done at a certain scale and a certain growth. A lot of the people I assume in the audience are going to be venture backed. They're companies that are trying to scale and they're companies that are trying to grow. So that's where the rule of 40 comes in. This is kind of a classic venture capital metric that a lot of companies are judged on. A lot of SaaS companies are judged on. Rule of 40 is super dumb, super simple. It's basically your growth rate plus your profitability. And the idea there is you can trade those off at different stages of your company. So I'll give you a few examples of what Rule of 40 looks like, because then it makes more sense. Let's say you're growing at 100% a year, but your profitability is negative 60. You would still be Rule of 40 because it's 100 minus 60. So you're investing a ton in your business to grow in order to get scale. And so in the short term, that's okay. You are burning a lot of cash. That's totally fine because the lifetime value is you only get the lifetime value of a customer over 3, 4, 5 years. So when you bring in a new customer, you're effectively losing money. You're going to be profitable on that customer down the line. And so that's where the rule of 40 can come in. On the flip side, a more mature business may be growing at 10%, but they have a 30% profitability in their operations. They would also hit the rule of 40 because they're very profitable. They're growing less fast than the first example, but they are profitable. Examples of companies that don't strike the rule of 40, if you're running at a deficit and growing at 0%, that's problematic, right? Because you're going to be at 0 for rule of 40 or even in the red. So it's just a kind of a very, very simple kind of dumb way to kind of think about the concept of growth. And so that's what I mean by pairing metrics is LTV/CAC is your efficiency metric and rule of 40 is effectively your scale metric, because you can kind of cheat at the LTV/CAC if you don't have the rule of 40. And then vice versa, you can cheat at the rule of 40 if you don't have LTV/CAC. And a lot of companies make the mistake where they will grow really fast. They'll look good from a rule of 40 perspective, but their LTV/CAC will be under 1. And so that's just not sustainable long-term. It looks good for 1 or 2 years, but then you very quickly realize this isn't a sustainable business in the long run. So this is just a very simple framework of how to think about it over a time period. When I kind of said it was conceptual, a lot of companies will be either in the orange here or in the red. Your goal is to get to the top right quadrant. And strategically, there's 2 ways to do it. Again, I think it's really conceptual. It's really contextual. It depends on the problems you're trying to solve. You can either try to fix your efficiency before scaling. There are times and places where that's the best course of action, or other places where first you just want to get into a place where you're scaling and you're growing quickly, so your rule of 40 is good. And then you can make your acquisition engine more effective so that your LTV/CAC gets better. There honestly isn't a hard and fast rule of which of those 2 quadrants you would want to go to first, but the ultimate goal is to always end up in the top right quadrant. Those are the healthiest companies. They have the best valuations. They have the best long-term prospects, and they're the most in control of their own destiny, are the companies in the top right quadrant. So that's what you're always going for. And so this is kind of the other point is it doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at other metrics. Like in my day-to-day, I look at literally not in any given day, but like in a given week, I probably look at hundreds of different metrics, but in my head, I have a mental model where I can, a mutually exclusive, completely exhaustive. I'm a big fan of the MECE framework, so you can look that up later. I have a mental model where I can stagger all of those from most to least important, and they all ladder up to each other. And I think this is a big mistake. That's why I picked this topic, and it's a topic that's very near to dear to me, is like a lot of marketers over time, or just because they're not as metric savvy, they do what's called like the tail starts wagging the dog. So are attribution models helpful? They can be. Are benchmarks helpful? They can be. Are OKRs and KPIs helpful? They can be. But when you start to run your business to hit a specific metric or to fit a particular attribution model, the order of operations is flipped and your logic is flipped. So like the whole point of having numbers and data is to guide your strategy. It's never a means to an end. And I see so many businesses and companies and teams that will do the flip. They will design their business in service of their metrics or their attribution model or their OKRs. And that is just not a good strategy. A great example is, we have an attribution model. It only gives you credit if you do X. Okay, well, now we have to change our go-to-market to do X. But X is actually hurting your conversion rates and it's not good for customers. That is the wrong thing. It's rather you either need to change your attribution model or you need to come up with a clever solution where you say, hey, we know we're not going to get full credit. So what's a good proxy for this metric? What's an indirect way that we can measure the effectiveness? Rather than what most teams will do is they'll actually change the customer experience to better fit the attribution model. I can't discourage this enough. And this is a big mistake a lot of companies make. Same with benchmarks. They just get obsessed with the benchmark. So they're like, best in class companies have X number for this particular funnel metric. Your funnel is unique to your business and the stuff that you're trying to accomplish. You need to look at benchmarks, obviously, to know kind of like, are you in the right order of magnitude? What do other companies look like? But never chase a benchmark for a particular metric, especially when your funnel has 8 different metrics. Focusing on just one metric will never serve you well. And then, same with OKRs and KPIs. So in short, attribution models are often a distraction, to be honest. And I wish I could give a whole separate talk about attribution models and something I often say, which is, people say a little bit of data is better than no data. I actually have the opposite assessment. I think a little bit of data often hurts way more than no data. And the short version of that is that it's often used to stuff out or circumvent discussion. Whereas when you have no data, you're forced to think logically about a problem, and you often get to a way better outcome than when you have a little bit of data. And so attribution models often fall into that fallacy where they can actually get you to make kind of the wrong decisions. They can be powerful. I use them at Hootsuite, but they are something to they're kind of a double-edged sword. So it's great to have supporting metrics, but if you remember two things from the talk, it's that LTV CAC is king. That is how you have developed a high performance revenue engine that takes $1, gives you back 3, or it gives you back 4, it gives you back 5, that's depending on the business. But now you have an engine you can scale, and you have a sustainable engine, and you need to pair it with the rule of 40 in order to push for growth and scale, because having a highly effective business that's doing, $1,000 of ARR is not the same thing as having an effective business that's doing $100 million of ARR. And so the rule of 40 forces you to also think about growth and scale. Short bonus slide, how to calculate LTV and CAC. So this could be a whole other talk, but I'll leave you with 2 points here to think about, and you can Google and do the research, and feel free to reach out to me, kind of offline on LinkedIn or something if you ever want some advice. I actually would argue, this is a little bit controversial, to invest in a slightly more accurate LTV model, because basic segments and cohorted retention really improve the accuracy. You can actually make a lot of mistakes on your LTV model if you don't have that. The other mistake I see people make is your LTV and CAC have to be what's called fully loaded. That means your LTV is your gross profit and your CAC includes all your variable costs. A lot of times people think they have a good LTV CAC, but they actually don't, because they're only looking at part of the picture. So that was my talk. I don't know if I'm over, Armando.
A little bit, but it was a good one.
I lied. I thought I had a short slide deck.
Appreciate that. So first and foremost, if there are questions from the audience, write them in the chat. We'll pick them up from there. Couple of reactions. First and foremost, thank you for this. Second, you lied through and through. It was not a short talk. It was a long one. It was not an equation. It was 2. And Emily in Paris is not your favorite show. What's going on? On a more serious note, so essentially the rule of 40 rules everything around you. Why 40, not 30 or 50?
That is such a great question. I think, as with all benchmarks, it's just a general order of magnitude. There's so many dynamics to think about. I don't think there's anything particularly valuable about 40, other than the fact that capital markets, that is what they're looking for, and it's the comparable that a lot of companies are getting. So that's
the rule of thumb / the incentive.
Totally.
I love it. One thing that I thought interesting, so one of the other sessions that we had was the CFO point of view. Mm-hmm. And funny enough, we were talking about LTV versus CAC as well. One thing that they mentioned was also payback time, but you didn't. Do you think about that? It's not as important. What's your point of view there?
100%. I think that's in the sub metrics.
Okay.
So that is exactly a great example of, you can only look at so many metrics.
Right.
Payback time is important. I think that you basically capture the whole picture with the 2 metrics that I talk about. Although, payback time is a really important metric we look at, but I would consider it a sub metric.
Okay. Awesome. So Antonio is asking, isn't the main attribution model required and important in order to establish consistency between all the different revenue channels?
So my hot take on that is that's essentially impossible to have that consistency. And I think that's where a lot of companies make huge mistakes and get hung up, is some tactics are just very easy to measure. Typically, these are click type tactics that are at the bottom of the funnel. Other types of tactics are really hard to measure. So any attribution model is going to prioritize and deprioritize certain tactics and channels. And so everyone wants a simple, clear-cut answer, and there are so many people who want to sell you a solution or a software or a service that
not really that easy.
It's never that easy, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's why I lied throughout the whole talk. There's always
the other thing that, like, if we can double click super quickly on, is this idea of the tail wagging the dog. How do you prevent that?
I think you prevent it by keeping people really focused on the North Star. I also spend a lot of time on this concept of MISI to explain to people how metrics ladder up and how to think about the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you just have to be vigilant. And I think it's because people are so stressed, they want to do a good job, you know, they don't want to get in trouble. They can easily kind of like just drift back to what I call the bad habits of the tail wag. It's so much easier to be like, I just want to improve this one metric instead of thinking about the big picture.
And then like 7 steps down the funnel, things are like going to shit, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
Last comment from Tori. Great. Now we have to delete the whole dang session because you lied. Like, all right. Thank you so much, Mo. This was awesome. And thanks everyone for watching. Let Mo know how his session was with the quick survey that you can find in the chat. We're going to be back in less than 5 minutes.